I'm Dave Dinkle, and thanks for joining me for this video series of actual recent deals. This is a deal that netted the student $13,106.21 with no money in the deal. The following is a real estate deal that was recently completed by a student. The deal exemplifies some of the various aspects of how we do these transactions. So as not to embarrass anyone involved in this transaction, all parties have been kept anonymous. I'm not a CPA, attorney, or realtor, and any information derived or found in this presentation is not to be construed as legal or accounting advice. This is an example of an A to B and B to C closing where the investor used transactional funding to fund the deal. In this case, the seller A, or the owner, sells to investor B, who closes at the student's closing agent. Then the investor sold to an end buyer using the same closing agent. This is what's known as a standard double closing. There was no money as it was funded with private money. No credit as no conventional lender was involved, and the student had no risk because he had no money in the transaction. This is an example of how it's possible to purchase listed properties below the list price if the seller is motivated. This is a listed property sale, not pre-foreclosed. This was a motivated seller who sold directly to the student through a realtor. Property was free and clear with no outstanding mortgages or code liens. The seller and the student, who was the buyer, both paid attorney's fees on the HUD-1 closing statement, which were higher than normal because of the price of the property being so low, and the title insurance was minimal on this property. Property was supposed to have multiple offers, and the student had to give his highest and best offer to the real estate agent to get the deal, which was only slightly higher than his first offer. We're now going to look at the HUD-1 closing statement, or A to B leg, and this is page 1. The student purchased the property for $35,000. The seller received $35,000 credit prior to deductions on his side of the HUD statement. Closing costs for the student were $1,131.75. We'll see those on page 2. The seller's closing costs were $5,163, it looks like. Again, we'll see those on page 2. $500 deposit by the student. These are taxes that were paid for the previous year by the seller at closing, and these are credits, the home warranty as well as the security deposit for the tenant that was in the property, and those become a debit to the seller and a credit to the buyer, who was a student in this case. These are accrued rent payments for the first part of the month. This is the security deposit. This is partial rent payment for the month. Again, debit to the seller, credit to the buyer. And the bottom line is the student had to bring in $34,100.55. Seller walked away after paying everything we'll see on page 2 of $26,210. Here's an example where the student paid $35,000, including his closing cost. He actually had to bring in less money than the purchase price. Now we're going to look at the HUD-1 closing statement A to B transaction, page 2. This is the big expense to the seller, $2,100 real estate commission. This is the funding fee. Remember I said to you that the student buyer had to bring in $34,100. He had no money for the deal. So the transactional funder brought in the money for him. That's the funding fee. Typically, it's not on the A to B, it's on the B to C, but here we see it on the A to B. These are just settlement charges to both the student and the end seller. Abstract or title search was paid by the seller. Title insurance was paid by the buyer. That gave us the opportunity to control who the closing agent was. These are attorney's fees. Again, these were charged to the seller, and the attorney reviewed the closing statement for the seller. Obviously was charged for doing that. These are just recording costs. These are doc transfer stamps. These are a lien search and a water bill that were paid by the seller at closing. So the seller's total out-of-pocket expenses off the HUD were $5,165, it looks like, and the students were $1,131.75. So now we're going to look at the HUD-1 closing statement, the second leg, or B to C, and this is the first page. Student sold the property for $49,500. The end buyer had to pay that. Student got a credit for it before his deductions. The settlement charge on page 2 is $522 and $395 junk fee to the agent. These are junk fees that have been put on about the last 5 years. Agents will tell you they have to be charged, but they don't. If they're not charged, then the agent has to pay them. It's a pure profit to the agent's broker. The cost to the student to sell the property looks like $1,626.13. The processing fee was also charged to the student. In this case, it was $395. Now, this is important. The end buyer put up a $5,000 deposit. It's important simply because had he walked away and the student not been able to close on the A to B leg, he would have made $4,500 because he had a $500 deposit up is all that he had. This is the payoff on the first mortgage loan, which is not a first mortgage loan. It's actually the money due to the transactional funder. As you can see, it's $34,400. Seller paid closing costs. In other words, the student said, I will pay closing costs. That's a credit that was given to the end buyer. These are just accrued taxes for the beginning of the year. Again, they're always a debit to the seller, in this case the student, and a credit to the buyer. So the buyer had to bring in $44,054.89, while the seller, the student, netted $13,106.21. The student in this case gave a credit for closing cost to the end buyer and their offsetting charges. Credit to the end buyer, debit to the student as the seller. Now we're going to look at page 2 of the B2C closing statement and get a closer look at what those actual charges were. Okay, the first thing we see is there's no real estate agent's commission. So we're going to get down into the settlement charges. They're $405 and $300 to the student. This is attorney's fees, which were charged to the student. Again, not sure why that was there, other than he charged him because he wasn't making enough money on the size of the transaction. These are the tax stamps for transfer. Again, recording fees. Bottom line is the end buyer paid $522 in closing costs. Student paid about, looks like $1,625.13. The final result of this transaction. This was a property flip that was listed, was not in pre-foreclosure, but it did have a tenant. The end buyer purchased it to rehab it and keep it as an investment rental because he already owned a portfolio of rental properties. The investor used transactional funding to fund the purchase. The student's net profit for this no out-of-pocket money transaction was $13,106.21 after all expenses, lien payoffs, and the cost of the transactional funding. The student and the original seller were charged attorney's fees to offset the low price of the property since the title policy was such a small premium. Thanks for joining me today. I look forward to seeing you at our next video series of actual recent deals.